Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is another Cybersecurity Cybertruck Edition workshop. These are hosted by the Q Project, and my name's Solomon Denning. I'll be presenting tonight's workshop. This workshop is going to be about SSH tunneling. So I'll be assuming that you all have a basic understanding of SSH, but for those that don't, I'll cover SSH a little bit before I jump into what SSH tunneling is, because you will need to know how to SSH to do SSH tunneling, as it probably implies by the name. So the first thing I want to make aware is that the Q project isn't responsible for anything that you do with the techniques that we teach you. Certain things and tools that we teach they can be used for harm as well as being used for good. And this is one of those. SSH tunneling can be very dangerous in the wrong hands. So what we expect is that people learning from these workshops are not using this for malicious use. And if you are using it for malicious use, we're clarifying that we're not involved or we're not responsible for what you decide to do with the tools we teach you. So starting off, what is SSH? SSH stands for Secure Shell. It is a remote administration tool, and it uses a common port 22, which I'll cover ports in a second in case you don't know what ports are specifically. If you're on a Unix machine, which means you're on a Mac machine, MacBooks, Mac, or you're on any Linux type machine, SSH comes by default. You don't need to worry about installing it. You may need to enable it. I know for Raspberry Pi, at least, when you install a fresh install of it, it will require you to enable SSH. I don't think certain machines do that, but you just need to check. And for Windows, sadly, they don't come straight with SSH, but there's plenty of ways to do it. One simple way is using PuTTY. That's what a lot of people use. You could just search PuTTY for SSH, download that tool, and it will work pretty much the same way. And another way you could do it, if you want to get inside the command line or the terminal, is you can install one of the Linux distributions from the Windows Store. The most basic one is Ubuntu. So you can install Ubuntu, and then Ubuntu will come with SSH, and then you can do stuff that way. But if you're new to SSH, it's pretty simple. It just allows you to remote access, like I mentioned. So say I'm at home, I would like to access my work computer. Say I was some IT professional, or say I was just someone wanting to access my work computer because I knew I was able to do it and I had some files I forgot. It's pretty simple. You just do SSH, the user at the host name. So what this means is your user is the user of the account you're trying to access. If for Raspberry Pis, the default user that comes when you install Raspberry OS, the default name is Pi. So I was just using that as an example here. So you see Pi, the user, at their host name. Your host name is going to be whatever your external IP address is, or in case you're on the same network, it's going to be internal. But I want to focus on external IP addresses, or IP addresses that people outside of your router can use to search for your router, because that's what SSH tunneling is going to be used for, rather than just SSHing on your own device. But before I go into ports and tunneling and all that good stuff, I'll show a quick example of how to just SSH in general. So here we have a terminal. Say I want to access my Raspberry Pi. You've seen me do this before. I did a workshop where I was teaching Pi-hole using Docker, and I did plenty of SSH and terminal work there. If you would like to see it in action, you can go back and check that. It would be on our YouTube channel, and YouTube channel is posted on our posters and all that such. If you're here on YouTube, welcome. Thank you for watching. And if you would like to subscribe, give us a like. We're trying to grow our channel, grow our presence. So quickly, SSH Pi at, I'm going to put an IP address in. This is the IP address of my Raspberry Pi on my home network. So because this IP address is on my home network and my MacBook here that I'm using is connected to the same network, it will easily go and connect to that. So now it's asking for the password of that Raspberry Pi. I'm currently on my Mac, so you're at this point, what you want to do is treat it as if you're on that remote computer. So I'm going to pretend I'm on my Raspberry Pi. I'm going to put my password in. And there we go. I'm inside my Raspberry Pi. I can search around, see all my documents. You can see I've got Pi-hole stuff here. So, and then whenever you want to exit out of your SSH session, you can exit with just the exit keyword. And there you go. Connection closed. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. I'm sure that everyone could understand how that works. So now let's talk a little more about what port forwarding is. So every IP address that's fully routable carries multiple ways of connecting with it. And these ways of connecting are called ports. You can think of them like signals or lanes in a highway. Each one takes you to a different destination, but it's all hosted by the same the same person. So there's 65,000 so ports available. That's just an example of like 2 to the power of, I believe it's 16, but it's just a large number of ports, which is a great thing because people that you make servers and large servers that are supposed to serve and access information need a lot of ports so a lot of people can connect. 65,000 ports means that 65,000 people can connect to your one IP address, which is great if you have a large server and you're trying to serve a lot of people. You have plenty of ways to do it at once. So let's see, some of the common types of ports are HTML or HTTP. I believe it should be HTTP. That would be port 80. FTP is port 21, and port 22 is SSH, which is what we're focusing on. So you can see that SSH is a port. So if you go to any IP address and you add the port 22 to it, it's going to tell that IP address that you would like to communicate using SSH, just as I did in terminal. And another quick note about SSH is that because this is used for remote access and a lot of professionals use this, it usually isn't blacklisted by a firewall. It's usually always available to use, even if everything else is disabled. So a lot of people will be like, okay, so if you're not, say you have a large business, if you're not logged in at the business at their Wi-Fi, you wouldn't be able to remote access in and grab some web pages using, say, port 600 and something. They wouldn't allow it. But if there's only one port open, it's going to be SSH port 22 because people need to remote access in for professional use. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes you need to configure it. For me, on my home network, I needed to go into the router itself, log in, and add or enable SSH because it wasn't enabled on the firewall. I assume that's because it's a home network and most people aren't SSHing into their own home network. So if you would like to do this on your home network, you're going to probably need to log into your router, figure that out, how you can add it. It's pretty straightforward on pretty much every single home router. So moving on from that, now what is SSH tunneling, which is the key of today's workshop or the topic. SSH allows for remote access to the server. You can view the files as if you were at the computer. But what tunneling does is it redirects traffic using ports under the SSH protocol. Why would this be useful? Why couldn't you just use the ports as without SSH? Well, one reason is SSH in the name, secure shell, is secure. The traffic is encrypted through and throughout. So if you're worried about people snooping on your information, this is a great way of protecting that because no one's able to see the information that you're sending. And Another reason why this is useful is because it allows you to gain access to things that you wouldn't normally have access to. And this is where the disclaimer comes in, because obviously not being able to access something and then trying to access it in most cases would be illegal. But say, like I mentioned, you're at your office and you would like to access something on your home computer. Well, you own your home computer and you're not really doing anything wrong in that sense. I'm not saying that I'm going to be liable for anything you do, but you you can SSH into your own home computer, grab information that you want using SSH, and most likely your office or your work company isn't going to allow you to do that any other way because of their firewalls, protections, all that. Now, there's three main ways of SSH tunneling, and it goes hand in hand with port forwarding, like I just mentioned. There's local port forwarding, remote port forwarding, and dynamic port forwarding. I'll go into those after I show you a quick diagram of how SSH tunneling works on a really basic, simple layman's term level. So, say we have this blue computer here, and that computer has an IP address of 10.0.0.1. Totally different from this one here, 192.168, and same for that one. They're totally different. But this blue computer wants to access information or grab a website. It wants to grab a website from the green server. The issue here is that there's a firewall just right here where this gray area is. These two computers are behind a firewall. So if this blue server went, hey, to the red server, I would like to access green server's website, it's not even going to have a chance to do it. So what we can do instead is we know that port 22 SSH is open. If not, it's easily enabled. We can set up a SSH connection like I just did in the terminal on my Raspberry Pi. Same exact way, logging or connecting to this red server. So now blue and red server are connected using SSH. Now we're going to port forward, and we're going to say, you know what, anytime I want to use this port number 8080, why don't you just redirect it through SSH, give it to the red server, and then the red server is going to say, oh, that belongs to the green server on port 80. So we're going to be mapping port 8080 to port 80 on this remote computer. These ports are what you would say is arbitrary. They don't really matter. This would be one of the most common use cases for it, but you can use any other port. Like I was saying, there's a lot of common ports like FTT or FTP, HTTP, all these things that allow for certain protocols or certain data to be transferred. And you could do all of that within SSH. So that's the main idea or gist of this, is that the blue server, because it can't connect to the green server through the firewall, uses a not a loophole but just an opening on port 22, and it gives some specific settings, and everyone knows how to or the computers, they all know how to understand this, and everyone's happy, they go about their business. So if we're going to go on to three types of examples, the first one, local port forwarding, the easiest way to think about this one is you want to tell yourself, I want remote resources to be accessible on my own machine, such as in the case of being at an office computer, trying to access some pictures or some music on your home computer. In that case, we're going to be adding a tag, or I believe it's called a tick or a tack, but it's SSH-L for local. Then you're going to supply a local port. This can be any port you would like. And as long as it's not one that's commonly used, you would want to use, say, port 80 here, because that's used for normal web browsing. But something, say, like 8888, would be great for the situation. Then we're going to supply the remote address. So this would be the IP address of whatever device you're trying to connect to, and that would be the IP address internally. So to make this a little more clear, I'm going to show you guys how to find the quick difference between external and internal IP addresses. If you look up external IP address, you're going to see a bunch of websites. These are all pretty much the same. You can just click on them, and they're going to give you an IP address that's external. What that means is that when you're on a home network, to save space, to make things easier, the IP address of all your devices, such as your phone, your MacBook, your laptop, computer, they aren't routable. There's only one routable IP, and it's the router that you have plugged in to your service provider. So you need that external IP because that's the only way for people to access you. So this is not that. This is an actual internal IP address of someone in that company. So if you know it, you can use it. Now the external IP address that's going to be used is this one after the username. This should look pretty familiar to you, the username at server.com, because that's what I just used in my terminal example. In my case, pi was the username, and the server, instead of being a DNS like or a domain name like server.com or youroffice.com, it was just an IP address. They're one of the same thing. That's something of a different topic to teach about if you have any questions about that. But an example of this is right here. So your local port, the remote address that you're wanting to connect to, and then a remote port. This is the port that the remote computer is going to be using. So anytime, what this is saying is all traffic sent by me on my own computer using port 8888 is going to be redirected actually to this machine on that port of this IP address. In this case, it's a domain name, but you could just use your external IP address by Googling it and finding it. So what I'm going to do is, this is going to be the demo for today, local port forwarding, but I want to cover the next two topics first, and then I'll go into the demo. So keep this information. I'll remind, or I'll do a quick summary of it after I do the other two. So the second one is remote port forwarding. The way to think about this is I want resources to be accessible on a remote system. This would be, say, your home computer has a music server on it, and you want, or more likely it would be like a website. Your home computer has a website, and you want someone else to be able to access it. You would use this. So this one is using SSH-R for remote. You're going to supply the remote port, the local address, and the local port. So it's flipped. And the example is here. And so what this is saying is that all traffic sent on port 8888 on a remote machine is going to be redirected to my personal computer on port 1234 at this IP address. So, yeah, that's the basic idea of this one. It's almost just the opposite of local port forwarding. Instead of you trying to access something else on a remote machine, you're trying to allow a remote machine access to yourself. And moving on to the third one, this one's a little more confusing. I won't cover it in detail, but I just want you to know that it exists, and it's called dynamic port forwarding. This is a way of doing proxies and all that. If you've ever been in high school, which I'm sure most of us have at this point, they almost all use proxies. A bunch of businesses use proxies, and it's just a way of making sure that your traffic goes to a certain location first before it goes to the internet. So the way to do this would be supplying a local port and then the username and server or the IP address of the person you're trying to connect to. So what this is going to do is it's going to open something called a SOCKS proxy on port 8888, and it will be listening. And then you can actually configure your web browser to use this IP address and this port, and everything you search is going to transfer to this remote server first before it is handled by anything else. So this would be nice. Say I don't know. Say it's after COVID, everything's back to normal. You're on vacation and you would like to access something on, what is it? Like you're at a restaurant, they have Wi-Fi. You're trying to access information, but you don't trust their Wi-Fi. Well, you could SSH. This requires you to set it up on your home network first. So say before you went on vacation, you're at this restaurant trying to access something on your phone, for say, you would have previously set up a proxy on your home server. Then you could connect to it using SSH, configure it on your web browser, such as Google Chrome, and then everything you search on Google Chrome is going to go to your home network first before it goes anywhere else. Pretty great feature. It can protect you from web or people that are trying to track packets, sniff packets, find what you're doing. Really useful. And so now what I want to do is say we're going to do the demo now. And like I was saying, the demo is going to be on this local port forwarding. So let's go back to my terminal. So in this case, what I did previously, where I did SSH pi at this IP address, this was all internal. This required me to be connected to the same network, pretty much. And you can see that if I put the password correct, I may have typed it wrong. There you go. There you go. I'm inside my Raspberry Pi. This is on the same network. I'm going to go ahead and exit out of this again, because what I want to do instead is type in a command such as this, like the port forwarding example. So you can see that we have SSH-L. Then we have a local port. For me, I'm choosing 8888. You could choose anything that's not used. And then I'm supplying, this should look familiar. That's the IP address of my Raspberry Pi on my own home network. So it's using the same IP address. If you know it, then good, you have the machine's IP address. But then there's this, the remote port, which is 80. And like I was mentioning, port 80 is for web browsing, HTTP, HTML content. So what this command is saying is that on my own machine, this MacBook here, anytime I search with port 8888, just go ahead and send it here to this Raspberry Pi on port 80. And then, well, how do I get to the Raspberry Pi? You need to know the external IP address. And that is provided as such. The name, the username of the computer you're trying to log into at the external IP address of the home network or the router or the business network. In my case, this is my external IP address. So I'm going to go ahead and click enter on this. And you can see does the same thing as I just did for my local network. So I can go ahead and log in. And there we go. We're logged in to my Raspberry Pi. The difference now is that if I was not on the same internet, say I decided to head to McDonald's and use their Wi-Fi, or go to Starbucks and use their Wi-Fi, if I typed this in, I'm going to be able to log in. I'm going to be able to access my files, do what I need to do. If I tried to use the other command, if I tried to use this one and I wasn't on the same network, it would say access denied. It wouldn't know what you're searching for. It would have no idea what this means. So that is the great thing about local port forwarding is you can access a machine from anywhere and it's all secure. None of this information is going through SSH rather than just HTTP or stuff like that. So it is a lot more secure because that is one of the main goals of HTTP is to be, or not HTTP, the main goal of SSH is to be secure and encrypted. So what I want to do now is I'm going to go back to this local port forwarding and I want to log in again. So there we go. I'm logged back in. And what I want to show now is if I come over here and I type in, let's see, it would be, I need to copy this. So I'm going to come over here, grab this external IP address, Command C, paste it. And I'm going to add port 80 to it. Or not port 80, my bad. Port 8888. And my bad, this actually isn't, this is incorrect. Local host. My bad. So, forget what I just mentioned there. So, what actually is going on is this. Okay, here we go. So, the way port forwarding works is, if you don't know what localhost is the IP address of your own machine. If you ever need to access something on your own machine, you don't need to remember your IP address. You just type localhost. But I want to visit localhost at port 8888, which would, in most cases, just lead nowhere. It would say this isn't found. I can't find it. But what I'm doing with this SSH command, like I was mentioning, is anytime there's an 8888 port on my own machine, it's going to send it to the Raspberry Pi. So that is exactly what happened. I did localhost port 8888 and it went to my Raspberry Pi. My Raspberry Pi currently is set up with Pi-hole. Like I was mentioning, my last workshop was on Pi-hole. And so what I could do even now is if I go to admin, we see the admin panel for Pi-hole. But the real neat thing about this is, like I was mentioning, it's available from anywhere. I could go across the country, SSH, connect to my router at home, and use my Raspberry Pi's IP address. And then anytime I searched this in my domain, it's going to go straight here as if I was at home. Pretty neat. This works for anything you could think of. The applications are endless. So I guess I urge you to learn about this because it's a great way to access certain information, even if it can be used for good purposes. So I'm going to go ahead and close that out. Go ahead and exit out of my SSH session and go back into present mode. So with that, my demo's over. The workshop is complete. These are the sources I used. Just a quick one for SSH tutorials for those that would like to read more. Here's a website on SSH tunneling, and it goes in depth, and port forwarding, which also goes in depth. So these are some great resources to use if you would like to read up more about it, more than I mentioned today. So with that, thank you for coming to tonight's workshop. I hope to see you back again for next week's. And thank you. Have a great night.